Welcome back to the Talking Shit podcast, presented by Colitis Unfiltered. My name is Frank Tabering, and today I am lucky to speak to Nadia, who got diagnosed with ulcerative colitis at age 15 in Toronto, Canada. Nadia, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
To set the context, I would like to start off and jump right into your IBD journey. So I think in a few sentences, if you could just give us an overview of the timeline from diagnosis, but also to how you are today.
So I was diagnosed with IBD, specifically ulcerative colitis, when I was 15 years old. I was having some symptoms, for a few months. And then when I finally had a colonoscopy just a couple weeks before my 16th birthday, that's when I got my IBD diagnosis. So I lived with IBD for about 25 years, right? I did, clinical trials, different medications, all of that. And in 2022, I was diagnosed with colorectal cancer, early stages, and now I live with a permanent ileostomy.
In the time sort of since your diagnosis, before your cancer diagnosis, were you in remission? Were you stable? Did you have flare-ups? How did you feel over
Yeah.
that long period of time?
So it was a long period of very up and down. So with IBD, flares can come at any time. And I went through quite a few of them, some of them, more severe than others, and treated, with a number of different medications. So, it was a constant, roller coaster, right, of emotions for sure. And, I did go through some periods of remission, especially before my cancer diagnosis. I was at a 4.5, almost 5 year remission, right? So that was a big win for me. And just, it took a lot out of me emotionally, right? To be constantly, worried about, when I'm going to flare, if I'm going to flare, and, when that kind of the ball was going to drop.
hmm So what I like to do typically on this show is I would like to take the audience on a journey, and then usually I start with the past, look at the present, and then go into the future. So let's go back to the basics, essentially. What were your first symptoms, that showed up where you thought, you know what, something is really wrong here. I better get this checked out. Take us through that a little bit.
So my first symptoms were, intense abdominal cramping, right? Having to use the washroom a lot, having, blood in my stool. And, the blood was just so scary, a huge red flag. And, that's when I knew this something has to be checked.
Putting yourself back into the moment where you were diagnosed, how did the doctor, if you remember, and especially you were 15, so you take these news completely differently than somebody age 29 like me, or even older. How did the doctor break the news to you? Do you remember that? And also, what went through your mind at that very specific time?
So I remember being in hospital, and I remember, my parents being with me. I was still young. I was a minor. And so they told my parents, as well as myself, I didn't know really what to expect. All I knew was that I was going to be having to take medication and take that medication daily. So to manage my disease. So it was scary. I have to say it was very scary because again, I wasn't familiar at all with the diagnosis. So not having social media or anything at the time, right? The internet was not really, a place for me to search. So all I had really was my doctor.
So that's actually a very good point, because I always talk about educating yourself, especially if you have a doctor that might not go into too much detail, right? And then I always
Yes.
say people should be very careful about what they read on the internet as well. But with the lack of the internet, so you said you only had your doctor. Does that mean that your doctor was somebody that you could trust from the beginning, somebody that was proactive in terms of trying to attack the disease? What was your relationship with your doctor in the first, months or years even?
At the beginning, right, because I also was so young, my only instinct was to just trust them and just do whatever they said, right? I didn't really do too much of my own research at that time until I got a little bit older, until I was more familiar with different resources that were available to me, right? There were some support groups that I found online, and through that I also found someone that I actually went to high school with that also had the disease, and we ended up being in the same clinical trial, like that whole kind of thing. So um that being said, right, like, in terms of trusting my physician at that young age, yes, I did have a lot of trust in my physician, and I just kinda did whatever she told me to do at the time.
So we talked about it already. 15 is a very young age, especially to be confronted with such a brutal disease. If you look back, not just age 15, but also the following years, sort of really those golden teenage years, how did you navigate the disease physically, but also or mentally?
At the time, I was super embarrassed and not open at all about my disease, right? It was like especially because of the nature of the symptoms, I didn't share that with anybody. Like none of my friends knew, if I had a flare up, I would just be away from school sick. Right. Like I never disclosed, what I was actually feeling or what I was actually going through. So that also in its own turn, like took a toll on me emotionally because I had to keep everything in. I mean, my family knew, of course, but it was hard to like, keep all of these kind of like secrets, so to speak, from my close friends
So then I'm assuming you also experienced this feeling that a lot of colitis patients experience, no matter the age, so this feeling of isolation and just wanting to
and
be alone,
loneliness.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Yeah.
So you had a period of 25 years that you were, like I said, on and off remission, and one thing that I kind of like to ask is because this is something that when I talk to people, they sometimes worry about. And this is sort of like burning through treatments, switching from one medication to the next. There's this trend that for people with severe colitis or moderate to severe colitis, very rarely you hear about them being on one treatment and that one treatment basically sticking with them for life. So could you quickly take us through some of the general treatments or medications that you went through, over the years before you were diagnosed with colorectal cancer?
Yeah, sure. So when I first was diagnosed, I was on a 5-ASA anti-inflammatory drug called Pentasa. So I did that. I was on Imuran. Prednisone was prescribed to me for flare-ups, and then, it came to a point where prednisone wasn't really working so much like for in my flares, right? So I switched to biologic medications. So the first biologic I did was in a clinical trial for Humira. That didn't really work for me personally. So then I went for another few years of eating a specific diet, trying different medications, trying natural remedies, doing all of the things. And I had when I was pregnant with my daughter. After I had her, I had one of the most severe flare-ups I've ever had, that lasted, almost a year because, I was just trying to do, like, so many things to try to get out of that flare, which, some things helped, but eventually ended up going on a different biologic, which was Remicade, and Remicade worked for me for, again, 4 or 5 years, then I, became resistant to that medication, and that's when I was in my final, clinical trial, final medication before remission. Sorry, before my colorectal cancer diagnosis, which was Rinvoq.
Very rarely do I find stories or even information about, pregnancy and ulcerative colitis and flaring. So I'm very interested to learn how you navigated pregnancy with colitis. Of course, you don't have anything to compare it to a pregnancy of like without colitis right before, but how did you navigate flaring or dealing with all the medication? Just yeah, take us through that a little bit.
When I was pregnant, I felt great. I had no symptoms, no flares. So, on my own accord, I stopped all of my medications, right? Which worked during my pregnancy. But then when my daughter was about, 3.5, 4 months old, my body flared like with a vengeance. You know what I mean? So, yeah,
It was your decision essentially to stop the medications.
yeah,
It's not like the doctor recommended it. Like you
no,
could have stayed on the medications throughout the pregnancy without any risk, right?
that's great.
You mentioned that you went through high school, I believe, right, with somebody that had colitis as well. Do you feel like having that relationship or that connection with that person, that was sort of a springboard for you to open up about the disease more? Or was there something else in life, maybe just just getting older that enabled you to actually come out of your shell, to sort of beat your loneliness, and to also openly speak about the disease more? When did that happen, and why did that happen? Because of what?
The person that I mentioned that I went to high school with, we ended up finding each other when we were in the clinical trial, so it was many years after high school was over, and so we just came to learn that we both had colitis in high school, but we both didn't know, right? So we both had the same approach of, not telling anybody, keeping it a secret, being embarrassed, feeling lonely. We shared all of those sentiments. But in high school, I started dating my now husband, right? And, I remember flaring pretty early in our relationship, and he was the actual first person, outside of like my immediate family that I told about my diagnosis. And ever since then, he's never, judged me for it. He's never always like took care of me. So I'm very grateful for that. So in terms of, having somebody to talk to, I not somebody that actually had the disease, but I did have him, to talk to and to navigate like, through some of the emotions that I was having, outside of like my family.
So you had periods of remission during those 25 years, but you had your flares. And I'm very active on the Reddit community because you really have, it's a space where people who are afraid to speak about it, I guess, around peers, family, this is where they go to ask questions. And one of the questions that I just come see pop up again and again is, hey, I'm flaring or have my first flare or this flare is worse. How do you guys deal with it? What are your tips and tricks? So how did you navigate flares?
Every time I speak about IBD, I always say that IBD is not a cookie cutter disease, right? So everybody is affected by IBD differently, and what works for one person may not work for the next. So that's the beauty of having like an online community or support system, because you can see, what works for one person may not work for another, but it gives you that, opportunity to try something you may not have tried already, right? So when I would be flaring, first thing I would do, is just eat a very plain, simple diet, right? Ensuring, lots of fluids and, nutritious foods, like, for example, like bone broth or, things that are easy to eat, easy to digest, things that don't upset my digestive system because it's already, on high alert. So, that those would be like my basic like tips and tricks, and trying to avoid stress, ensuring, you get enough rest, because, even in a flare up, it's hard to rest as well because you're always running to the washroom. You're waking up in the middle of the night, going to the washroom. So like you're constantly tired, right? So ensuring that you get a lot of rest and, a lot of nutrients is really key.
Yeah, so definitely from what I'm hearing is you centered the management of your flares around dietary adjustments and making
Yes.
sure that you don't sort of worsen any symptoms based on what you eat. Maybe looking at your experience with colitis, but also going through colorectal cancer, how has this misadventure, if I can call it that, changed you as
Yep.
a person?
So I think personally, like, having my cancer diagnosis and then my living with an ostomy has kind of really enabled me to want to share my story even more, right? When I had IBD, you know, there's always the possibility of the outcome to have an ostomy, right? Because when you don't respond anymore to treatment, or you flare up severely, you would have may end up with an ostomy. So that was always on my mind, and I have to say, like, even when I was diagnosed with cancer and I knew I was going to have ostomy surgery, I was initially less concerned about the cancer and more concerned about living with an ostomy because of the negative stigma that I myself had associated with ostomies, right? Like, maybe being judged for it, how the way that it looked, if it was smelly, right? Like how I was going to manage my ostomy. But I had started my Gutsy Girl Diaries, Instagram account prior, and blog like prior to my colorectal cancer diagnosis. So, already having a platform to share with others in the same, situation, or caregivers in the same situation, really helped me to, navigate through my diagnosis.
You mentioned it. There's a lot of stigma around, living without intestines. So
Yep.
let's break that stigma down. How are you living with this today? And are you limited? Is there something that you cannot do? And also, do you still have issues sometimes? Because again, for some people, it's like having surgery is not necessarily a cure, right? For IBD, it can still be present. So how are you doing? And what is life like for you in this situation?
So overall, I have to say my ostomy gave me my life back, right? A lot of things that I would be fearful of doing with IBD, I now can do with my ostomy. Like, for example, going on a road trip or, going to a concert and, not having to worry about urgency or, finding a bathroom or that kind of thing, right? I mean, there are still like the challenges that I have with my ostomy in terms of, dealing with ostomy leaks or, finding the right appliance and ensuring like, I have the right products and being prepared. There's all of that. But as a whole, right? Like, um, health wise, I am so much better, right? My inflammation is so much lower. My energy levels are so much higher, right? Because, I no longer have active IBD, right? Although I do have other IBD associated, symptoms or
Mhm.
conditions, right? I don't have like that urgency, right? And I think like for anybody with IBD or even IBS, that feeling of urgency is like one of the worst feelings, right?
Mhm.
And I remember after my surgery, like being in hospital and kind of finding it weird, like that I didn't feel that, right? Because I was so used
Yeah.
to always being like so nervous, so tense, right? Because of that urgency feeling. And it's just terrible. So I don't miss it.
Right. Yeah. And so this is very interesting because you feel something for so long, you do something for so long, and all of a sudden, from one day to the next, it ceases to exist. How long did it
Yeah.
take you to actually get used to, well, the lack of that feeling and this new feeling that you had?
If I had to say something, I would say like 6 months, right? Because
Hmm.
sometimes too, like even like the whole adjustment with, having an ostomy and doing different things with my ostomy, right? Like I had to take it like little things at a time, like for example, traveling or going swimming or, just because I wanted to ensure that I kind of understood everything that went along with having the ostomy, right? So, yeah, I would say about a 6-month period, like, it took me to really feel like, "Oh, wow," like, you know, I don't have to go to the washroom like I used to kinda thing, or I don't have those feelings that I used to.
So we can summarize this again, and I think it's very important to focus on this: is like living with an ostomy is actually completely okay, right?
Yes, it is, it is. I mean, it does have its challenges, but overall, it's very possible, and you're not limited in doing anything that you don't want you know what I mean, that you
Mm,
wanna do.
mm. During that period, and especially getting used to the ostomy as well, how has that impacted like your own body image and also your relationship with your husband? In what ways has that sort of impacted you or affected you?
So, for me, it was a very personal thing, right? Like, I do share about my ostomy online. I do show my ostomy online. That took a while as well. But, my husband never made me feel uncomfortable or anything like that. Like, he always embraced it. I mean, he always like does my ostomy pouch changes with me, like, and it's just that extra level of, care and support is, you know, so important, right? And navigating, even through IBD, through any kind of like, health concern or health issue, I think is super important, right? And, in terms of my body image, like it took me a long time to accept, how my body would look. And even now, like looking back at old pictures where I don't have the ostomy, like it's kind of foreign. Like I forget that how my body looked before, right? But my husband says, like, sometimes I don't realize it, but he says that I seem more confident in my own skin or in my own body now than I did before surgery. So, I feel like that's a positive thing, right? And I'm not as embarrassed anymore as I was when I first got it. Like when I first got my ostomy pouch, I would dress in such a way to always kind of try to hide it or, make, look normal, right? So, yeah, it's been quite a journey in terms of body image. It's still a struggle every day, but overall, it's good.
Yeah. So when I reflect on my own IBD journey and what I went through, I always look at ulcerative colitis or IBD as a blessing and a curse. In what ways do you relate to that train of thought?
A blessing in the sense of, it's kind of like a red flag or an alert that, we all have just one body and we really have to do our best to take care of it, right? And to nurture it and to give it what it needs to survive, right? Like the body is like an amazing machine, right? And I think it's just so important to give it the care, right? And to, be mindful of what you put in your body, make sure you move your body and keep it healthy. Certain things are outside of our control, right? Like an IBD diagnosis or a cancer diagnosis or, certain illnesses. But what we can control and in terms of what we put inside our body and our output, I think is important.
Very well put. I completely agree with you. For people that are out there that are struggling, who are afraid, who don't have the disease under control, what is your message to those people?
So my message is, one day at a time, right? And to just focus on, the things that are working, right? Sometimes it's hard to, kind of get out of your out of a negative mindset, like when you're in a flare and thinking, I'm never going to get better. I'm never going to, do the things that I want to do, right? But to always, persevere and to never give up.
So you've been with IBD for a long, long time, and of course, times have changed, but in some areas, times have not changed, especially when it comes to misconceptions in regards to IBD, colitis,
Yeah.
ostomy. What do you think are some common misconceptions about IBD out there still today?
I think some common misconceptions, right, which um I speak to as well, the whole notion of like, somebody like doesn't look sick, right? So, sometimes it's questioned in terms of, like how come today you're able to go out and the next day you're not, right? Like, so there's a lot of like, misunderstandings or misconceptions around um the nature of the disease, right? And, how can it be like so up and down, right? And I think, you know, just having the opportunity to share, right, just really gives perspective, right, for other people who may not know much about IBD, that, I kind of like a day in the life, right? That, some days you can do all the things and other days you just really can't.
Now, the last thing that I want to mention in regards to the past is if you could go back and you could speak to yourself, your 15-year-old, on diagnosis day, what would you say to yourself?
I think I would say to myself not to worry, that everything will be okay, and to always, look at the bright side of things and to stay strong. So,
Sometimes keeping it short and simple is actually carries a lot more power than going into a long tirade. So I can appreciate that. You are an advocate. You are doing your part in raising awareness. You mentioned you're active on Instagram. You started a blog and you named it the Gutsy Girl Diaries. Can you tell us a little bit about that, a little bit about what it is that you do and the ways that you try to support others with this condition or similar IBD?
yeah. So, I started Gutsy Girl Diaries in 2018 when I was in a severe flare up and just when I was starting my clinical trial with Rinvoq. I decided that I wanted to break the stigma and also put myself out there and, identifying, what would I have wanted if I was just diagnosed, right? And going back to, like, when I was 15, there was nothing available to me, right? And some people find it so hard to share, right? Like, even when I post something, I'll get a lot of people who won't comment on the actual post, but they'll send me a private message because they don't feel comfortable, right? And that's the point, like creating, a safe environment for people to share, to be open. And the word gutsy, I just got from, you know, before starting my actual page, and like, going on Instagram, going online, anything like that had gutsy associated with it, referred to IBD, right? Right. Or something like that. So I just kind of used it as that, and I just went with it. And so, I share my recipes, I share, my day to day, what I do for exercise, my treatments, that kind of thing. And it took me through, like, my colorectal cancer journey and living with an ostomy. And it's opened me to, so many different connections and people and, partnerships, with, for example, Colorectal Cancer Canada and, other people and other brands.
Oh, that's really great. And so, for everybody who's listening or watching, we're going to put links to all of that in the show notes as well. So you can check out Nadia's blog and connect with her individually as well. Do you have today any regrets when you think about disease management over the years? Decisions that you took, maybe decisions that you followed from your doctor or doctors? Any regrets?
I have to say, no, I don't. I know that, when we talk about the doctor patient relationship, I think that that's super important. And I had a really good relationship with my GI. Again, she's known me since I was first diagnosed at 15. And, we had our rocky periods, when I kind of didn't want to take my medication. I didn't want to do what she was telling me to do. So we would, butt heads, but it ended up being a beautiful relationship in the end. And it really helped me advocate for myself, right? Because when you have that comfort with your practitioner, it makes, you sharing exactly how you feel and your symptoms exactly how you are. That's makes it that much easier, right? And I really feel that that's also kind of what saved me, right? Because if I didn't feel as open to share with her when I was just kind of feeling kind of off and it wasn't really a flare and I don't know what I should do, right? Had I waited and, my diagnosis with my cancer could have been a more severe one, right? So I think that, patient advocacy is a huge thing that I speak to. And I think it's so important for everybody to have that comfort and that voice for themselves.
Yeah, this is a very interesting take because I always speak about how important it is to have a gastroenterologist who's very proactive, right? Who listens to you, who acknowledges your concerns. But you raised an interesting point is that sometimes you actually have a doctor or GI that is very proactive, but it's the patient that is reluctant, right? Or sort of like comes back with some resistance. So having a very good relationship, I think, will have help break down that fear and that barrier. And this is what I advocate for most. Find yourself a proactive doctor, and if you have one, you find one, you're very lucky, and listen to them. In that case, that means they really have the best at heart for you.
100%. And I feel like too, like they will advocate for you as well, right? Like, because one hard thing that I had to deal with between my IBD diagnosis and my cancer diagnosis was that after my surgery, I technically don't have IBD anymore, right? Because, ulcerative colitis affects the large colon only, right? And I wasn't going to be seeing her anymore. So it was just a very emotional time with that as well because she
Mm.
became, such an important part of my life, right? Seeing her every 6 months, right? Sharing, all she saw me all through all my, you know, journey in life, right? Like graduating university, getting married, having children, right? So
Mhm.
it's just they become a part of you as well. So I just feel like that is just so important.
And really amazing, I have to say, and I'm very happy that you got to experience this, is to actually be able to stick with one GI essentially
Yeah,
through your
I know.
entire journey over such a long period of time. That's really, really amazing. So,
It
a
is like we
stroke of
used to
luck.
joke. Yeah, we used to joke about like, I'd say like, oh, like it's 20 years, like I've been seeing you, and she'd be like, oh, well, you're getting old, right? So, we always had that like banter between us. So, and I feel
Mm.
like that also it helped me to be more open as well.
Yeah, love to hear it. So I want to part with you by looking ahead a little bit. And even though this question might be very, very hard to answer, I still like to get your feel for it. Do you think that we will see a cure to IBD in our lifetime?
I really hope so. I really hope so because there's so many different advances in medicine and changes and, you know, opportunity of, studying different aspects, right? And the more people share, I feel the more opportunity there will be for a cure, right? Because there's, like I said, IBD is not a cookie cutter disease. So it's hard, to manage every different aspect, right? That people feel. So I really do hope that, one day there is a cure because it is such a terrible disease.
Nadia, thank you so, so much. I think this was a very inspiring conversation. I really love how open you are, and I love what you're doing as well with your Instagram, with your blog. So make sure everybody who's listening to check this out. And thank you so much again for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for today's episode of Talking Shit, presented by Colitis Unfiltered. I'm Frank Tabering, and if this hit home or hit your gut, do us a favor, subscribe to the show, and follow us at Colitis Unfiltered on YouTube, Substack, Instagram, Threads, TikTok, and Reddit. We'll see you soon for more inspiring stories from the bathroom floor.